Welcome back. Black people are losing jobs at an alarming rate, and we want to know why. Joining me now to talk about it are author and content creator Garrison Hayes and DEI consultant Tirrany Thurmond. Thank you to you both for being here. So Tirrany, I want to start with you and to talk about the impact that this really has on families.
Yeah.
There's so much whiplash here. You know, in April, we saw the lowest Black unemployment numbers in history. And now in June, we're seeing 90% of those who were laid off or fired were Black people.
Yeah.
So what effect is this having on Black families?
Yeah, I mean, it's having a huge impact when we think about the families that are, impacted by this unemployment rate. We're talking about families that don't have access to housing, that may not get adequate access to food, and also having the ability to really pay your bills. So when we think about people being unemployed, we have to be considerate of their ability to take care of themselves collectively, and also how a community begins to rally around those people to ensure that each one gets their needs met.
Garrison, the White House has responded to this, and they've said, and they've been very proud of their Black unemployment numbers. This has been something that they've been talking about for months, the historic lows that we've seen with Black unemployment. And in response to these June numbers, they're saying, well, not so fast. We can't really extrapolate too much from 1 month's worth of numbers. We really should wait for quarterly numbers to come out. Do you think that's fair, or is there still a lesson to be taken from what we saw in June?
This could be, as some experts say at the Urban League, a little bit of noise in the data, meaning that statisticians could have been a little off on their numbers back in April. And then looking at over the next kind of couple of months, we'll see if that correction is really just getting better data. But I don't think we can really have this conversation without also considering the ways in which the culture has truly shifted over the last few years. Moving from Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020, where everybody seemed to love Black people, to the change in tone that we've seen when white people don't get to be the center of attention for a single summer. And now that change in tone is significant. And so we're seeing that change have real life implications on whether or not, as you mentioned, families can feed their kids. We've seen these people go on the anti-CRT and anti-Black history crusades. And I think this is a real life implication of that anti-woke crusade that we've seen over the last several years.
Yeah, and you are absolutely right about that. I mean, it feels like in 2020, they couldn't get enough of, diversity talk, and a lot of it felt performative. There were, Black people on commercials all of a sudden. I mean, Black people falling from the rafters, right? Now it seems that there's a little bit of DEI fatigue. What are you hearing about what's happening in the workplace when it comes to diversity and inclusion efforts? And where does that leave Black people in the workplace, those who are employed, but may be feeling a shift in the culture?
Particularly as a consultant, I think it's really important to consider people who do this work, myself included, we look at ourselves as the subject and the object of the work. And so we are essentially embodying socialized identities that have been marginalized, but we're also advocating for attention, for adequate services, for adequate resources to ensure that our lives can still be whole. So when we think about how that shows up in the workplace, people are tired. The Black tax is real, me having to take care of myself economically and taking care of other people, and me having to go to work and ensure that my qualifications aren't challenged, that my intellect isn't questioned. And so when we think about how people are showing up at work in their working environments, the fatigue associated with doing diversity work is extreme, but also being a person of color or from a historically marginalized background and showing up in these spaces can be even more exhausting.
And what do you think is the appropriate response to diversity issues in the workplace? I've always found it to be a little bit troubling that you're asking people to clean up a mess that has harmed them.
Yes.
It's like, well, why aren't those in power doing the DEI work? Why are you asking Black people to clean up a mess that's been hurting Black people? So what is the appropriate response if a company or place of work really does want to address their diversity and inclusion issues?
Yeah, I think one of the things that organizations really have to start thinking about is how do we identify positionality and power? So when we think about dominance in the workplace, particularly white supremacy in the workplace, because it shows up, and how do we make sure that we're working as an organization to ensure that we're repairing past damage and we are mindful of historical issues? Because you can't just go in and think that you're going to fix something without acknowledging the historical challenges that got us here, because otherwise we end up hiring people of color, particularly Black people, and say, okay, we're going to have this person serve as our vice president or our manager of DEI, with not truly understanding what that role consists of and not giving those leaders the appropriate resources that they need to do the work and be impactful in the work.
Yeah, that's an important point, is that are you setting people up for success, or are you setting them up
Exactly.
for failure? Garrison, and going back to these unemployment numbers, you have said that you think there's a larger agenda at play. What do you think is really going on here?
Black people aren't perceived as valuable. And so when we see the economic forces and the shifts happening in our economy, Black people are often seen as some of the most expendable assets within an organization. And so that larger agenda is really at work to remove Black people from the places of power that we found ourselves in. You know, we see this happening specifically in the law. I think we're all familiar with race-based affirmative action in admissions being overturned by the Supreme Court. Well, the very people who brought that lawsuit, namely Edward Bloom, is also working to ensure that there are no diversity quotas on publicly traded companies. Now, this is important for us to think about. You know, there's been an effort to ensure that Black people have representation in the workforce, in these corporations, publicly traded corporations, no less. And there are efforts to ensure that those quotas, that those safeguards, that those efforts are destroyed. And why? I think it's patently anti-Black. That's the agenda, in my opinion.
When we think about things that happen on a micro, meso, or macro level, there are individuals that are working tirelessly to ensure that they are making the money they need to sustain their lives. But if there is an organization that is not committed to diversity, that is not committed to making sure that their systems are equitable, that is not committed to ensuring that there's a commitment to inclusion, then unfortunately, Black people will continue to lose economic opportunities, essentially losing jobs. This is why I'm a real big advocate for ensuring that there's an entrepreneurial spirit in you that we're consistently tapping into to make sure that we're creating our own opportunities for ourselves and for our communities.
Well, to that end, and I love the idea of empowering ourselves and empowering our communities. And of course, when it comes to employment, that's somewhat limited, because if you're not an employer, you can't necessarily help solve this problem. So what are some ways that we can support each other?
I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is that there are people in positions of power in corporations right now, Black people who have influence and have power. Use your influence and your power to support Black contractors, production companies, creative agencies, DEI professionals, speakers for ERGs and business resource groups. Bring those folks in. They are experiencing a great deal of turmoil at this time, and leverage your influence to do that. Be present in the community and support people with businesses, large and small. I think that's a phenomenal way for us to continue to invest our hard-earned dollars into our community.
Yeah, and that's an important point, is to spend our money where it really counts and in a way that supports our own values. Tirrany Thurmond, Garrison Hayes, I appreciate your perspectives on this really important conversation. Well, speaking of labor, when we come back, what if I told you that there was an entire group of Black people who are working, but only because they are forced to, and they get paid next to nothing? That's coming up after the break.